Hi, everybody. Welcome back to Psychedelics Today. We're joined today by the executive director of SSDP, Kat Murti. How are you doing today?
Hi there. Thanks for having me. Always love joining Psychedelics Today.
Yeah, this is going to be a fun one. We have far too much to talk about, but we're going to have a great time anyway. So, Kat, can you tell us just briefly about what is SSDP?
Sure. SSDP, Students for Sensible Drug Policy. We are the largest youth led network working to end the war on drugs and replace it with policies rooted in scientific evidence, compassion, and human rights. We do that through our work in harm reduction, drug education, campus change, as well as drug policy work at the local, state, federal, and international level. We have about 100 chapters and across the US and a number of different sister organizations around the world. I won't talk about this too much, but anybody who's interested in getting involved with us and helping us end the war on drugs and legalize people who use drugs can check us out at ssdp.org.
Is the war on drugs a war on us?
The war on drugs is a war on us.
Yeah, hell yeah, thank you. And let's talk a little bit about you. Like, what's your background? What led you to SSDP?
Sure, absolutely. Have I have always opposed the war on drugs. I remember just like as a kid, in like the 90s, seeing images of people, AIDS patients who were end of life, had severe wasting disease, etc., getting arrested by DEA. The raid on Dennis Peron's shop up in California, not even shop, like his house, where he was treating
Hmm.
these end of life patients with cannabis. And these people couldn't walk. They're getting, wasting disease. They're getting dragged out on mattresses and things by DEA because they're getting treated with a medicine that makes the end of their life a little bit better. And that was just, it was so formative for me. And then I think just seeing as I got older and starting to see, I went to public school in Texas and starting to see around fourth grade, fifth grade, police are coming into the classrooms. We start getting like the drug dogs. You start seeing classmates getting arrested, and you see what happens when kids, because these are kids, it's not even teenagers yet, start getting that record, and it completely pushes them off. They're not able to do well in school. You shut off the options for college, for higher education. I mean, like, nowadays I talk to people who had a cannabis possession charge 35 years ago, and they can't get a mortgage. They can't rent an apartment. They can't be a PTA mom because they can't go to their kids' school for official events and chaperone. I mean, like, all of these kinds of things. And seeing that early on really impacted me. And so I'm someone who really cares deeply about individual liberty. That's probably my biggest motivating factor. And the war on drugs is one of the hugest government programs that is really negatively impacting every single one of our human rights. And it is the human rights of people who use drugs, people who use substances, which, let's be honest, is all of us. I've got a giant mug here of coffee next to me. Caffeine is one of the most addictive substances, and most of us use it every single day. And it's not disruptive because it's legal, right? So it is a war on all of us, but it's also a war on our ability to own our bodies. It's a war on our communities. It's a war on families. Families are torn apart. It's been a war on civil rights. So many of the biggest intrusions on American civil liberties in this country have come about because of the war on drugs. It's racist. It's racist in its origins. The very first anti-drug law in this country was part of the Chinese Exclusionary Act, and it was back in the 1800s, and the plan was to keep the Chinese out of America by outlawing smoked opium. Of course, they didn't outlaw any other form of opium because laudanum, opium itself, was consumed mostly by wealthy white women in the form of laudanum. So you don't have that. And then you start looking when marijuana gets criminalized in 1914, it was under the Harris Tax Act, and it was called marijuana because cannabis, again, was widely used. And so they needed to rebrand it as some sort of dangerous Mexican drug being brought across the borders that these black jazz musicians were using to seduce white women in order to criminalize it. And you just that same rhetoric carries over and over again, right? So it's just something that's always been deeply concerning to me, and just offensive. It's such a big problem, and so it was something I was interested in from a young age. I found the National Organization for the Reform of Marijuana Law normal, and I'd wanted to get involved with them. They wouldn't let me join until I was 18, so joined on my 18th birthday back in 2006 and got involved with the DFW normal chapter. And when I went to college in Berkeley, California, I looked for a normal chapter. I looked for folks to push back on this, and there wasn't one. I got involved in other things. And then one day I was sitting in a class called Drugs in the Brain, which is, by the way, the class I scored worst in my entire academic career because it was a organic chemistry class at Berkeley. Everyone else was going to go be a doctor, and there was me, and I was just like, I just want to learn. But it was fascinating. Someone came in and made this announcement about this new campus group that they would be starting called Students for Sensible Drug Policy. And so this was in 2008. I was busy at the time, but it's sort of been like rattling around in my brain. And over Christmas break, I was thinking about, okay, I want to use my time to rededicate to the things I care about. I remember this announcement. Let me go check out SSDP, join the chapter. Found out that this was a group that had been around since 1998. One of the first chapters was actually at Berkeley. They came about to originally push back against, well, first, when they started at the University of Rochester, it was because the university wouldn't allow a cannabis club to form on campus or to get any student funding, and they pushed back on as a First Amendment violation, right? And then they had their first gathering of young people. They put out a notice online and gathered young people and realized, oh, we could start chapters across the country. SSDP was born, and the first big issue was pushing back against the fact that at the time, the Higher Education Act allowed you to get federal funding for blocked people who had prior drug convictions from getting federal funding for higher education, not for anything else, just drug convictions. You could have murdered, you could have raped, you could have kidnapped, you could get federal funding to go to college. But if you had a marijuana possession charge, sorry, right? And so so I start finding out about this, and I meet all these cool, amazing people, and I got hooked on SSDP. I graduated, went on to work at the Prop 19 campaign. That was the first adult use campaign in the US since 1972, back in 2010 in California. And I wanted to stay involved in SSDP. So I joined the board of directors. We have a youth led board because we're all about helping young people, empowering young people to be the voice of change. And so I joined the board of directors then. That really shaped a lot of the opportunities that I had over the next decade. And then, I was going into my second maternity leave and thinking about where I wanted to go with my career, and found out that at my next, that our current executive director let me know that he was planning on stepping down, thinking like, oh God, we have to hire another executive director. Over the last 11 and a half years I've been on the board, we've hired 3 of them. That was a really hard process. I started pulling this together, and I was like, oh, you know what I'm really passionate about and what I already dedicate all my free time to and really care about and want to work on. And so I, with about 2 weeks to go before my due date, gave the current board, hey, so here is all of my notes from the last 3 executive directors that we hired, and also why I should do it. And so I got officially elected on as executive director 3 days after my daughter was born. I did my first official meeting with her strapped to my chest when she was 2 weeks old, and officially announced it at the Drug Policy Alliance conference at the end of 2023. So it's been a ride since then. We've taken on the DEA in court. We've met with every single office in Congress. We've been pushing for cannabis legalization at the federal level, decriminalization in various cities and states across the country, psychedelic stuff. It's been fun, Joe.
Well, amazing. So I want to switch gears to a project I'm a big fan of yours, is this recent meta censorship campaign. And it's been hard. Like the whole, I think, drug and psychedelic ecosystem has been very much harmed. And how I think about our work is um, we're radically reducing harm. Got well over 750 podcasts out, a bunch of blogs, and like the fact that we can't like operate and leverage Meta as a platform or multiple platforms like to
Yeah.
spread harm reduction, risk reduction info, like that literally harms people. And they're just taking down pages and not really letting people advertise anymore. I kind of don't want to give them any more money anyway, but like what's been going on? What did you observe and what made you want to kind of step up and get involved?
Yeah, absolutely. I've always been an internet evangelist. I'm an elder millennial, so I remember the world pre-internet, and then the excitement when you could set up your first email address and this world of information. And um, and I got to kind of have this front seat as the whole social media world started to develop. I got on Facebook back when you had to have your college email, and you had to wait for your college email, and you had to get approved by the college that they knew who you were for you to get your Facebook page. And then I worked in digital communications for 14 years, helping sell ideas about freedom and liberty online. And so I remember this world when it really was this exciting brand new thing. And this was this way to connect with everybody. And all of a sudden, people who up until then have, for the most part, stayed in their own small community for most of their lives, most Americans, most people still alive today, um, live within 50 miles of where they were born. Right. And so, like, this connection, this ability to access information we never had before. It's not just the legacy media, but it's all of us creating stuff, connecting stuff, meeting other people, finding our communities, and all of that. And over the last decade, I think really since about 2016, we've seen increased censorship. And so when it comes to Meta is one of these big companies that really, for the most part, is not just the front page of the internet, but most of the internet. People get their news primarily off websites like Facebook, and Meta owns Facebook and Instagram and WhatsApp. And that's a significant part of just how we communicate with each other. And so the way that they've been tackling this is we've seen a whole bunch of both outright bans, people getting their accounts shut down, people getting kicked off, losing their whole, really their jobs a lot of times, stuff that they've built up. They had like 1 million followers and now they're back to zero. Um,
Mm,
and this is happening for not just folks who are engaged in legal industries like the legal cannabis industry, things like that, but also folks who are simply educating about drug policy, who are educating about harm reduction, about naloxone. So it's been a real attack on the psychedelics, cannabis, and harm reduction communities where information is shadow banned within the algorithm. We're not allowed to talk about bills that are coming up. We're not allowed to talk about just research about stuff, public health research, about access to, going out and talking to your Congress people, your legal, your representatives about policies that impact you. All of these things are getting caught up, supposedly because they're promoting drug use, drug sales, things like that. You know who is able to still exist, though? All of these actually fraudulent botnets that are selling fake drugs and can just keep popping up in different places and selling people unsafe things. They get shut down, they pop up again. But who doesn't get that information out is people like you, with the excellent information that you can get on this podcast. People who, organizations like MAPS and Shakruna that we all know, who are, again, legitimate nonprofits who are working to increase information. They do research, they do policy work, they do anthropology and science, and these are the folks who get shut down. We've had issues getting out information. We've had posts frozen because we were talking about things like our Cannabis Week of Unity, which is our annual week where we encourage everyone to get together in Washington, D.C. and push for federal cannabis legalization, getting people out of prison for cannabis. There's still 3,000 people, by the way, who are serving life term or very close sentences for cannabis in this country, mostly for less than dispensaries deal with in a day, many of them within a mile of a dispensary. And like
Is
just
that a broad split between federal incarceration and state level?
Yes. So that's just at the
Hmm.
federal level. There's tens of thousands of more folks in prison at the state level. So that's actually where most of it happens. But all of this information is getting frozen. And so we've come together at SSDP and we have a letter out. We're encouraging all organizations that are in this cannabis, psychedelics, harm reduction space to ask Meta to take seriously their responsibility as honestly one of the biggest information purveyors in the world, right? And to stop shutting down information about public health, about science, about policy, to stop freezing people's accounts, to stop deleting accounts, to stop to stop shadow banning this kind of information, and really to have a much more holistic and much more responsible approach to the role that they've chosen to take on. So we have over 100 organizations on that letter so far, and we actually opened up a petition as well for individuals to sign. And so our goal now, I think we've got about 150 or so organizations. We're shooting for 1,000 organizations. So if anybody here has a company that engages in legal hemp sales, cannabis sales, is in that psychedelic space, is a psychedelic therapist, is a researcher, anybody like that want to join that organizational letter. And then every individual here, I really hope, will stand up for free speech, stand up for freedom of information, freedom of expression, and sign our petition.
Yeah, thanks for that. It's important, and I think y'all are taking a really great approach. What is the what is the angle of attack? Is it just like getting attention on it so that people understand, and hopefully Meta employees and team members kind of get loud as well? It's just kind of like a public pressure campaign.
It is a public pressure campaign. This is an issue that we brought up. We had a private meeting with Meta last year, and this was one of the issues that we highlighted for them as a nonprofit engaged with them, that this has been an issue. We can't fundraise on Meta platforms. They won't let us. They keep shutting us down. We've had issues with our own accounts getting frozen. A lot of folks, when we're trying to talk about conferences we're going to, or asking folks to make sure they're registered to vote, like these are very basic civil society services, right? That's what makes us a nonprofit. That's what makes us an effective nonprofit. And so we brought up this concern to them then. We know that it's been brought up. We really want to make sure that we're putting that public pressure on them, that they understand and that they're willing to engage with us in a realistic way and really change these policies, because they do have an impact, not just on us, but on society at large, because most people do get their information on these platforms. Most people do engage with other people on these platforms. We've seen the impacts that social media has on how we treat each other in society, on the issues that we think are important, on what we believe to be true, right? It changes the nature of elections. It changes the nature of everything. And so like we need a more responsible approach from Meta and from other companies that really do have their finger on the button here. I mean, we used to live in a world just a few generations ago where there were three news stations and you had to watch those three news stations, and they had a certain type of responsibility that they were expected to have, because that was all the information that there was, and that was extremely restrictive. And that's what social media really came out of and pushed back against, was all of a sudden now you could get access to that information that you couldn't get before. And it's turning back into the sort of monopolistic environment where we're not able to access that information anymore. And I think that that is a real problem for our society.
Yeah, yeah. If we're yeah, there's a lot of reasons why we need to be educated. So next topic. Well, actually, here's some uh stuff. It looks like you've got somebody who wants to join in Baltimore.
Oh yes,
So where
Mark.
can people reach out if you want to if they want to try to join up?
Yes, go to ssdp.org and hit that join SSDP button. We've got a form. It takes about a minute to fill out, and we will reach out to you, or you can follow us on social media or email us, and we will come join us, help us get people out of prison, legalize drugs, and allow for research.
Amazing. Next one is 1914. Was this
Yes,
one here?
that is the so the first policy there is the Chinese Exclusionary Act. So that was passed in, forgive me, I'm bad with dates, towards the end of the 1800s. And then the
Hmm.
1914 is the Harris Tax Act. That was what originally criminalized marijuana. And it's actually really interesting. It's incredibly racist policy, but it's really interesting, especially when you look into the history of how it was passed. It's really interesting is that their approach, they didn't actually criminalize marijuana, because you have to realize this is pre prohibition, alcohol prohibition, and they believed that that was unconstitutional. And I would argue it's still unconstitutional to do so, but they implemented a tax. So it was criminal to buy or sell or possess marijuana without a tax stamp. So you had to purchase the tax stamps, but they didn't sell the tax stamps.
Mm. All right. um, People that are listening hopefully know that I'm a huge fan of drug war history, and everybody should get as educated as they can on it so they can find out
I'm
how
a huge nerd.
absurd it is.
So
Um, yeah. Okay, so I reached out to you the other day in particular about this new executive order around forced institutionalizations, which is like a
right.
major reversal since Reagan times. And, one we didn't even get a chance to chat about this. Like one thing I've been noticing is that like as certain civil services are cut back, effectively what happens is things are outsourced to the police, and
Yeah.
then incarceration and institutionalization is now potentially going to take some of that away from the police, but it's still going to be part of their burden to put people there. I think,
Yeah.
but we'll see how that actually plays
Someone
out.
something that they don't want to do, it's at the point of a gun.
Right. So, can you describe what this new executive order is and what it does?
That is an excellent question. So the first question is which executive order, because there
Yeah.
really have been so many. There's another one yesterday. We're really legislating by executive order at this point, which raises or should raise all sorts of alarms just for the way that our governmental system is meant to be set up, and along constitutional lines. But beyond that, just drug policy in particular, we're doing a lot of legislating by executive order, and I don't think it's necessarily great. The one that you're talking about came about a couple weeks ago, and it's, I think, a reaction to a lot of the cultural conversation, a lot of the culture war conversations we've had about quote unquote, and I'm using this offensive term on purpose, but drug addicts in the streets in places like New York or San Francisco or Portland, and this stigmatized image of homelessness, of drug use, or really the people doing this would say drug abuse, like all of these kinds of things. And this is an attempt to like clean up the streets. A lot of people have said that that deinstitutionalization has gotten a lot that happened in the 80s has gotten a lot of pushback for, like, this is the cause of this. I think we've seen a lot of ties to frustration about houselessness, about economic instability, really get tied to drugs, whether it's stuff like Measure 110 in Oregon, or a lot of the views that people have about what's happening in places like Denver and Portland and San Francisco now, right? Let's be honest, beyond the simple civil liberties question that you own yourself and no one should be able to lock you in a cage for what you choose to do with your own body, as long as you're not harming anyone else or harming what they choose to do with their own body in doing so. Forced treatment doesn't work. It's not treatment. People need to want to not do drugs in order to not do drugs. And in fact, it can be very traumatic. It can cause people to want to do more drugs. It can lead to higher rates of overdose. I mean, it's a hot mess, to be honest.
Hmm.
There's an experiment. There was this experiment called Rat Park, and I think this really points to some of this issue, right? And so scientists took rats and they physically addicted them to drugs, to various types of drugs. and they put them in a cage, bright lights 24/7, like locked into a cage all by themselves. And then they gave them the option between pushing a bar for food and pushing a bar to self administer more of that drug that they'd already physically addicted them to. Unsurprisingly, you note that they just keep pushing that lever, and they'll keep pushing that lever without even going for the food. They'll starve themselves essentially to keep going
Mm.
for this. But then, if you then they took a different group of rats, right? And
Mhm.
they created what they called Rat Park. They created like a social community with a lot of like enrichment and like fun things for the rats to do, and they could integrate with each other and things like that. And then they take a series of rats and they physically addict them to some drug, and then they put them in there with this. And the rats, for the most part, they have lots of other things to do, and so they don't keep going back and pushing that lever. Maybe sometimes they do, but they also push the lever for food. They're also like playing with these other rats and playing with the toys in there and things like that. And then they take the rats from that first experiment, the rats that keep pushing that lever, the rats that are not going for the food, and they put them in Rat Park with these other rats that are formed this social community and things like that. And those rats over time start doing other things and not pushing that lever, right? And I think that this is really powerful, and it's something we really need to understand, because it's not necessarily drug use that's the problem. It's the stigmatization, it's the environment in which we find ourselves. People end up in chaotic drug use. Yeah, there's a number of different reasons. Drugs can be very physically addicted. Many different drugs, not all of them, but many different drugs are very physically addictive. They can also be addictive for other reasons, which oftentimes are because people lack that enrichment. They lack that social connection. They lack a reason to feel like doing better with their lives, for doing other things with their lives. They don't have social responsibility. They don't feel like a connection with other humans. There's something missing from their lives, right?
Mhm.
And I think that that's something that we see with houselessness. I think that's something we see with joblessness. That's a part of the reason that we see increasingly young white men, particularly in rural areas, turning to opioids, and that's really led to that high spike in opioid overdose rates amongst young white men. It's because they're in areas where the traditional means of making money have more or less dried up. They're not interested in or engaged in education. They're not pursuing educational opportunities. They're not socially engaged. This is a really big one, because if you look at amongst the same group, if you look at young women who do not have full-time education, full-time employment rather, a lot of times they are, however, they're raising children, they're engaged with grandparents or parents that they're taking care of. They oftentimes volunteer in places like churches. These same young men are not doing that, and then they're turning to opioids to kind of fill in that gap. And I think that we've seen those same patterns, whether it's the crack epidemic, whether it's the heroin epidemic, whether it's all of these different things that we've seen spikes of over the course of our history. Those things are caused by this lack of feeling humanization, feeling like there's something that you can have a positive impact on, that you can change. And as long as we don't address those problems, they're going to continue. And forcing people into institutions, first off, costs a massive amount of money. It costs a massive amount of money for people who claim that they're doing this for fiscally conservative reasons. It's not fiscally conservative at all. But also, it's not effective. It's not impactful. These people are even more isolated, even more stigmatized. They're highly unlikely to be able to treat their chaotic drug use in a way that would actually be helpful to them. And they feel even more othered. They don't have anything to engage with outside of that. What we really need is we need to look at the societal causes of all of these problems and start creating more of those social networks, start making people feel more part of their community, give them opportunities, give them things. And so part of the cuts that we've seen have been to things like what's called housing first policies. So housing first policies attempt to address this by saying that if you're struggling with chaotic drug use and you are living on the street, you know, what we need to address first is we need to get you out of the street. Let's get you somewhere safe so that you're not, you know, in the street, maybe passing out and things like that, which is, I think, a lot of what people are upset about. They don't want to see that. So it's like, okay, great. Let's get you that house. Now that you have that house, then, you're not worried about where you're going to sleep tonight. You're not going to worried about if you're going to freeze to death, if you're going to get rained on, if someone's going to attack you while you're asleep. All of those things, addressing those concerns, we can then start looking at, okay, can we get you to a place where you want to address your drug use, where you feel that it's getting in the way of your goals, that you can see something else for yourself outside of this, that you now have a reason to want to use drugs differently or not at all, whatever works for you as an individual. And it really does vary by individual, right? And part of this is that we've cut those programs, which were kind of starting to work. Those are actually a fairly new approach, and we've only just started to see it, and we're already stopping it.
Mm-hmm. So you had a really good analogy earlier. Well, first, before we do that, I want to mention somebody in the comments kind of like made a little comment on Rat Park, and I agree that I personally want to do a bunch of work on Rat Park so we can tell that story more. But like I can also testify that like my addictions go away in a more enriched environment. Like when I'm in a more enriched and social environment, I do a lot better. I think that's the case for most people I know as well. So anyway, that it on that point. Can you share that kind of story you had earlier about sure you can skip the dentist and how that relates here?
Ah, yes. So this is not this, but another executive order um, made major cuts to SAMHSA, which is a government agency, but specifically it made cuts to their first responder trainings, which has been a series of programs that are meant to address the opioid overdose crisis. We have an opioid overdose crisis in this country. Millions of people have died from opioid overdose, and it's worth mentioning that it's not because opioids are illegal, because every time they've cracked down on opioid prescribing and made it harder to get these drugs legally, opioids legally, more people die. Right.
Mm-hmm.
So prohibition's not the cure. What is the cure? What has actually caused in the last few years opioid overdose rates to start to go down? A big part of that has been access to things like naloxone, which is a life-saving medication that actually reverses opioid overdose and saves lives, as well as training on how to use it, training on how to address this for first responders and things like that. We've now made cuts to those programs. And so, SSDP is we're nonpartisan. We work with both parties. We really focus specifically, all parties, I should say, really. We focus very specifically on drug policy, drug education, ending the drug war with whomever and however makes the most sense for us to do so, right? I personally am ideologically a libertarian. That is what drives me, myself, how I make my decisions in my life are whether or not they are liberty maximizing. And I would describe myself as fairly fiscally conservative. I'm not a huge fan of government funding in general. And I do think that our government spends way too much money on way too many things. Personally, I would make some giant cuts to some departments, like, say, the DEA. But what we're talking about here is not fiscally sound. It's not fiscal conservatism, because when you're making cuts to things like naloxone, to first responder trainings, etc., what you're doing is you're making these tiny little cuts that actually don't take that much out of the budget, but are creating long-term problems that are going to cause us much more, both in terms of like treatment costs, ER costs, all of these kinds of things, but also in terms of lives lost, harm to the economy, all of these different types of things. So to get back to what you asked about my earlier example when we were chatting offline, that's like saying I'm going to save money by no longer going for my biannual dental cleanings, because it costs me $50 twice a year to go get my teeth cleaned. So I can save $100 a year. Well, that seems smart until you don't go to these biannual dental cleanings. You're not taking care of your teeth to save those $100. And now you need 4 root canals that cost you $12,000. And that's what these kinds of policies do. They're not actually saving us any money. What we're actually doing is we're just it looks like we're cutting money in the short term. In the long term, we're going to create all of these future problems. A lot of people's lives are going to be lost. Probably millions of lives will be lost because of this. And it's going to cost us a lot more money. So we're actually costing ourselves money for these tiny little cuts.
Hmm. Yeah, and not to mention just the other compassionate aspects. Like I like to stack, so we have like the fiscal angle and like the economic consequences, but then we also have a little bit of compassion. I'm told that's not what Americans do these days, but I think like, some of us still have that. We want to be a little compassionate. And
Yeah. Yeah,
I
well, and it gets
think
back to the internet thing I talked about. I think that, like, as I said, I was an early internet adopter. I've always been an internet evangelist, and things like social media for a long time. It gave us or just the internet in general, gave us the opportunity to see how people who are not like us live and to really have more compassion. And it's been a great frustration of mine how many people have instead used it to become even more insular and even more hateful than ever before.
mhm, yeah, it's nuts. So okay, another um
Well,
I
if
don't
we're
know.
going to talk
Go ahead.
about economic illiteracy and executive orders and drug policy, there was a new one that dropped last night. I've glanced through it. I haven't had a chance to fully process everything that's in it, but essentially, on top of these other executive orders that are likely to increase the opioid overdose problem, right? Cause more deaths because of opioid overdoses. The latest solution is apparently a new executive order yesterday that's going to place tariffs on Canada because President Trump is blaming Canada for not doing enough with border security to prevent fentanyl from coming into the United States across the northern border. Um, there's so much I have to say about that. First off, is that fentanyl is a medicine. We do not want to criminalize it. I feel like I need to bring that up first
I've
and
used it a
foremost.
bunch of times and it's been amazing every
It
time.
helps people. It helps people. It's one of the best drugs for back surgery, for C-sections, like anything like that where you need something that really helps people, but you don't need them to be conscious. You have a C-section surgery. I've had two. You're cutting through layers of someone. You're completely cutting through muscle and tissue and removing your organs, and you need them to be conscious and awake throughout that whole process. You need something like fentanyl. It's a really powerful and important drug, and that needs to be said simply because there's too many efforts to criminalize it now as a result of people simply not understanding what's happening when it comes to the opioid overdose crisis, right? And to continue with not understanding what's happening with the opioid overdose crisis, we're now apparently laying more tariffs on Canada in order to somehow stop opioid overdoses here in the United States. Please explain to me how that happens because I don't know. And it's worth mentioning. So we're going to tax not just Canadians because tariffs are a tax on the US people. When we have tariffs, the whole goal of a tariff is to make things cost more to US consumers, to make it easier for US companies to compete against companies outside the US. Tariffs are a tax on US consumers, US tariffs, right? So, and they don't even work because we don't really make downstream. We make mostly downstream production. So, like, we don't have those things early on. So, those producers in the US, their costs go up too. So, it's a mess all across the board. But also, like, if we're talking about illicit drug markets, they don't pay taxes in the first place, right? This whole problem is that we're creating an an illicit drug market by we're creating this illicit drug market by criminalizing opioids, by cracking down on so-called pill mills, by making it difficult for doctors to prescribe opioids to chronic pain patients, to people who are end of life, people who really need these opioids for basic quality of life so that they can continue to hold down a job, so that they can continue to be able to spend time with their children, with their grandchildren, to engage in their community because they are in too much pain otherwise, right? So we're taking drugs away from those people who then are now desperate. We create this whole illicit fentanyl market. Um, and a big part of the reason, also, the other big reason that we've seen these opioid overdoses come up, that we've seen so much fentanyl in the market, is because fentanyl is so potent, right? So that drugs that we used to see like heroin don't exist anymore, really, in the same scale, because fentanyl is so much stronger that if you have to engage on an illicit level, the fact that you need so much less to have the same impact matters a lot more. Now, consumers don't want that. They would prefer usually to have a much lower dose, but because it's called the iron law of prohibition, and because it's illegal, it gets stronger and stronger and stronger, leading to these overdoses. All of this, right? And now we're saying that we're going to increase taxes on US consumers, essentially, in order to somehow stop illicit drug sales that don't even get taxed. Please make it make sense.
Well, they can't. Um, yeah. So everybody, foundational books here, just go read about the drug war. Two tips. Drug use for grown-ups. Three tips. High Price, Carl Hart, and then I really like Narconomics. It's kind of like a fun read, but also like a helpful kind of playful read on drug war economics.
Oh, there's
Um,
another great one. I can't remember the name off the top of my head, but something the scream, catching the scream, taming the scream,
chasing the
chasing the
scream about
scream. That was
Anslinger.
it. That's it. So, since there was a few questions about the history of the drug war, that's a really good
Hmm.
read on that one.
Yeah. Um, I'll plug myself too. So I got published in this psychedelics and philosophy kind of compendium, and they had us kind of write about. They wanted us to write about ethics in the drug war, and I was like, I don't like. Can't you just tell the story and it's intuitive? And so I had to like study what ethics were because I don't really understand it. And then we ended up writing a brief history of the drug war for this volume,
Oh,
out by
that's cool.
Bloomsbury.
Okay. So I'm
Kind
gonna
of
want
philosophy.
to copy that.
Yeah. So there's some good stuff there, and so it's just a short drug war history in a journal type thing, and people need to be aware.
Yeah.
And okay, so speaking of drug war, can we cut to DOI DOC? Do you feel complete on that
Yes.
last one? Cool.
Yes.
So you, SSDP, and a few other folks like have been participating in this fight against the DEA wanting to schedule DOI and DOC, which are, at least DOI is a very important compound for researchers. Been tons of papers out about it. I've not really heard of people using it. So like, what's this story and where do we stand
Yeah.
today?
So DOI and DOC are psychedelic compounds. They were discovered, or at least understood, that they're discussed to some degree in PCOL by Alexander Shulgin. They've been around since the 1970s, and yet you probably haven't heard of them. You might have now, because we've been talking about them, because we've been fighting the DEA in court to keep them legal. But most psychonauts, most folks in the psychedelic space, really haven't heard about them because they're not used recreationally. Where they are used, since the 70s, they've been found outside of labs less than 20 times. They don't show up. There's never been ER records. They don't show up
Hmm.
on surveys of drug use. None of this. No one is using these drugs, right? But who uses them are scientific and medical researchers. DOI is the best anti-inflammatory drug we've ever found. And together, DOI and DOC have been used to understand how serotonin works in our bodies. So there's well over 1,000 peer-reviewed papers that rely upon DOI and DOC. About 80% of what are they called, SSRI drugs on the market have been developed using research that use these two compounds, and they're used to really look at medical cures for some of the biggest ailments that are really hurting our communities. Everything from anxiety and depression to even things like pain management, inflammation, cancer, right?
Hmm.
And the reason that these have been so widely used is because they're not scheduled. They're not on the Controlled Substances Act whatsoever. which is very important because once a drug is added to the CSA, it's very difficult to do research with it. It's you need to have a special license, you need to have a special lab. You're talking about adding years to your study. If you need to if you discover something interesting and you want to slightly adapt your experiment to be able to further explore that area of research, you have to completely start over with your licensing protocols to be able to do that. It's a mess. It's a mess. It takes years and years and until probably millions of dollars to be able to do these studies, which of course, like, think about the downstream costs as well to consumers who might then be using these drugs to help their lives. And we think about things like drug prices. This is the reason for them, right? And the DEA wants to add them to Schedule 1 of the Controlled Substances Act, which would shut down over 50 years of research into all these things that are looking really promising for us being able to improve the quality of lives, save lives in this country
Hmm.
and worldwide, because this research really impacts everywhere. And so they announced in 2022 that they were going to add DOI and DOC to Schedule 1 of the Controlled Substances Act. Some folks from our science policy committee at SSDP, who are for the most part postdocs and PhDs, not entirely, but many of them, who are also drug policy nerds, noticed it pop up on the Federal Register. We sent a letter objecting, pushing back on it, and asking for a hearing. Went a little bit back and forth, and the DA ended up rescinding that announcement that they would be scheduling it. But then they came back right around Christmas time in 2023, again announcing it. And we really think that they didn't expect any pushback the first time around, because the scientists and researchers who are using these drugs in their labs at places like Johns Hopkins and stuff, for the most part, are not following drug policy. They don't read the Federal Register. Most people don't read the Federal Register, right? Most people don't know that it exists. So they're not going to be the ones pushing back. It's not going to be the folks in drug policy, because we don't really think about these as drug policy for the most part. And so I
Hmm.
think they really weren't expecting a response. And so they came back right at Christmas time, again, I think hoping to sneak it under. But we have a bunch of big drug policy nerds who noticed. We filed a letter, we demanded a hearing, we went back and forth, and we were actually in court. And the DEA ALJ court, which is basically the DEA's own court within the DEA, super weird, creepy experience. I know you did an episode with Hamilton Morris talking about his coverage and what it was like as a journalist and a psychedelic researcher himself, who was in court with us observing this whole process.
Hmm.
But so we were in court for about 2 weeks. We had scientist after scientist in all sorts of different fields coming up and talking about how this is going to negatively impact their research and how their research is going to be shut down and why that's so important. And we'd gone into this. The DEA first tried to silence our scientists. They said that they couldn't testify. And then we pushed back, and then they said they could testify, but they couldn't talk about the harm to their research. And that was kind of a question, even as we were going into the hearing on the first day. The ALJ judge, who was assigned to our case, said, I haven't yet made a decision on this point, but I will allow SSDP to make arguments about research harm. I don't know the extent to which I will actually include that in my weighing of the decision. And then, after hearing scientist after scientist in these different fields talk about about the research that they're doing, about all these incredible things that they're doing around substance use disorder and pain management and the really cool stuff. And then they say, and all of this research is going to be shut down, and I'm going to lose my funding, and I won't be able to continue to pursue my postdoc or things like that because of the way that this is structured. On At the end, the judge actually asked us to specifically focus our post-trial brief on research harm, which is really cool from a legal perspective, because this is the very first time in US drug policy history, possibly worldwide drug policy history, that we are ever considering the harm to research caused by scheduling drugs, which is, by the way, terrible, and tells you how poorly thought out drug policy is, that we don't even look at how criminalizing drugs that we use for research harms research, right? But so this was very cool. We are kind of waiting for the other shoe to drop and see kind of where things went once we filed this. And then on World Psychedelics Day, the final day of Psychedelic Science 2025, the MAPS's biannual conference that they do for folks in the psychedelic and research communities. The DEA judge in the case issued his recommendation. And first off, that timing, I think, is honestly like on purpose. It's been that case throughout. We know that they follow our social media, that they're seeing our posts. They came into court with printed out binders full of each of our social media posts so that and they're pulling stuff up and trying to discredit people. Dr. Elena Jaster, they had her on the stand and they pull out a tweet of her saying that we should decriminalize all drugs and try to use that to which was wonderful because it opened up the conversation about actually, yes, we should. And that is something that I can say based upon the scientific evidence and the evidence that I do in my work on substance use disorder, not my work, Elena's, that yes, we should, because that is better. And here's why, which we never would have been able to discuss otherwise. The transcripts, by the way, are all on the SSDP website. So you can see the insanity that is this entire court process where the DEA's so-called go-to expert on hallucinogenic drugs says that the DEA makes most of their decisions on scheduling based upon things like reading your Reddit posts. That's it. They don't want us to talk about the science that's being harmed. They want to base it on obvious shit posting. That is the actual term that is discussed in the court documents, by the way, on Reddit. So on World Psychedelics Day, we get the recommendation from the judge that what's really sad is that he goes through and he's like basically says he agrees with SSDP that scheduling DOI and DOC are going to cause serious harm to science and medicine. And he agrees that the DEA should move ahead with scheduling DOI and DOC. So this hasn't actually happened yet.
Was there a reason? Like, was there an internal logic that he was using?
I can't postulate on why people make decisions. I will say that I highly recommend that people go and read those transcripts because there were just a lot of really chilling moments in court that it felt almost like McCarthyism, right? Like, where it's like, are you a communist? We'll shut down everything. They were making threats to these scientists. They were asking them like, do your colleagues know you're here? They had lists of people who were at their universities who also have Schedule I drugs. And they're like, are they concerned that you're coming here and testifying at the DEA? Why would you bring that up if not to make a threat to try and shut down people's ability to share information? I feel like there was a lot of that happening. I will let people
like they didn't have a really good legal argument. They needed to do some other shit.
Creepy, to be honest, it was seriously creepy. My skin is crawling even just remembering what that was like. But yeah, so he issues this, and then he immediately retires and says that he's recusing himself from the case and retiring. And so then the case goes on to, and it's worth mentioning, so I should clarify to folks, he has issued the recommendation. The DEA has not yet formally adopted the ruling. They need to adopt the ruling. They could also potentially just like decide not to and go against his recommendation. That seems somewhat unlikely since they wanted to schedule it in the first place. By the way, their so-called proof of abuse, the reason that this was an emergency that they needed to schedule DOI and DOC, someone had posted on Reddit a Johns Hopkins research paper in which DOI was used. This is a medical research paper, right? And someone made a joke in the comments or like, oh yeah, I think I've heard about that substance. I think I heard about 200 to 300 people in the woods doing that. And someone else comments, oh yeah, so that was a PTA meeting, right? This is an obvious joke. That is the shit post. That was the proof of abuse. And it was strongly alluded to in court as well that the other proof of abuse was all these scientists doing this research. This is the abuse, the fact that they use it in their labs to try and solve medical issues. That's proof of abuse because it's not officially Schedule I says that it has medically approved use because it's not being administered to humans as an FDA approved drug, the fact that they're using it for research is so-called abuse. Anyway, so this hasn't been adopted yet. Judge Sofling retires. He then recuses himself and says that Judge Maroney, who was the ALJ, the DEA ALJ Chief Justice at the time, is now to oversee this case. Lots of folks might know his name because he's the one who's been overseeing the cannabis rescheduling case, right? Well, funny thing, guess who then retires and recuses himself from the case? Judge Maroney, who is now retired and recused himself from both the cannabis rescheduling case and our DOI DOC one. It's worth mentioning, by the way, when we went to court on DOI and DOC back in November 2023, the last time that a hearing like this had happened was in 1985 for MDMA, right? That was a couple of years before I was born. And this has happened. And then cannabis was right after it. These two cases are the first time in a generation that we've even had this. And now both the justices have retired. There's no justices in the ALJ court. It's now in the new DA administrative head. He's been in office for like a week or so now, a little over a week. And it's now up to him to figure out what to do with this. He did say, it's worth mentioning, he is an old-timey drug warrior. He's been involved with the DEA in the past, but he didn't say which direction, but he did say that cannabis rescheduling was a day one priority for him. Of course, things have been a little messy for him, and he's had a few more than days than one so far, and we haven't heard much about it. But yeah, there's certainly some interesting developments happening at the DEA. We don't know how this is going to impact, but we are not giving up on this fight. We have been, it really is a David and Goliath fight. We have a multi-billion-dollar agency, the DEA, that, you can FOIA it, but probably has spent millions of dollars just on that, 6 days of us in court, and who knows, all those other legal filings ahead of time. We are a tiny 501c3 nonprofit. We're supported by mostly individual donors giving us like $5 a month, $20 a month. Please donate, by the way, so we can do work like this. But and like the goodwill of a lot of people who just want to see change working together for free, really, more than anything else. And we've held it off for 3 years now, and we fully intend to keep taking this fight. So if they go in and they say DOI and DOC are Schedule 1, we will be appealing this in federal court, and we will be highly questioning the right of the DEA to make these scheduling decisions, first off, to make and enforce these decisions that they've clearly implied have are against scientific and medical science, are pushing us back into the dark ages, and honestly, highly questionable that they even constitutionally have that right to do so, particularly after SCOTUS decided last year against what was so-called Chevron deference that allowed administrative courts to exist and to make and decide upon, to rule in their own courts. They're essentially like extrajudicial courts, and we will fight them on this because we care about science, we care about truth, and this is not just about psychedelics. Obviously, these are psychedelic research chemicals, but research harm, this push right here is actually going to negatively impact anybody who's doing any work when it comes to understanding public health, when it comes to understanding what we need to do to make a healthier, happier society. And so this is something very important, and we're not giving up.
Yeah. So one of the final things here, like what I'm noticing is just drug policy conversations just seem radically illogical and kind of just like throwing power around.
Yeah.
And honestly, the consistent trend, even with Anslinger, it seems like there's regular careerism here. Like we're gonna harm people so we can keep our jobs.
Yeah, sure. I mean,
go ahead.
Yeah, I don't know how nerdy you want me to get here, but there's this school of thought called public choice economics, right? And essentially, like, here is the problem: is that people are people. People are encouraged to follow their incentives. That's just who we are naturally. That's what all animals, we are animals. And like all animals, we respond to the incentive structures, right? And if you set up incentive structures, if you believe that people can do good things and people can do bad things, why would you then say that when you take these people who can do good things or do bad things, depending on what benefits them individually, if you put them in a big group, in a big faceless group, that they're not going to do the same thing, right? Obviously that same thing will happen. And when you have stuff like the DEA gets billions of dollars a year that are now at threat because of things like cannabis semi-legalization, quasi-legalization, the hemp markets, things like this that Americans writ large want, right? About 80% of Americans across the board, Republicans, Democrats, everybody in between, say that no one should be locked up in prison for cannabis.
Hmm.
About 60 something percent want psychedelic medicine to be legal. They want people to be able to get psychedelic therapy, right? The reason that these things are still criminalized is largely because industries, and that is what it is, like the drug enforcement industry, make millions and billions of dollars off of locking people into cells, off of selling licenses to do all of this stuff, off of threatening people, which is what they do, to come to the conclusions that they want them to come to. And I think that you really can't overlook that. And part of this is maybe we need to restructure the way that our incentives work in these agencies, because I think that there are opportunities for us to construct a drug policy in which um, some of the folks who are currently so focused on prohibition, which we know harms our society, which we know causes drug overdoses, causes crime, causes families to be ripped apart, for children to grow up without parents, for all these major issues that causes more substance abuse issues, that causes unemployment, all of these terrible things that are caused by prohibition. What if we realign those incentive structures where we say, look, like, we want a society in which people are able to more safely access various substances that they can choose how to use in their bodies. And we want them to have the right information and the right education about the way in which they can do so most safely with the least harm and in ways that will benefit them rather than ways that will harm them. Right. And I think that if we realign those structures, there are ways that we could have a society in which we had things like the DEA that were focused more about things like, hey, instead of trying to throw flash bomb grenades into someone's window because you think that they may have been selling pot illegally, maybe instead you could be focused on things like making sure that if someone is selling psilocybin chocolates, that those are actually psilocybin chocolates, and that there is a clear and easy way to test those things and see what's in it and make sure that the consumer knows what they're getting, and that the consumer knows how to consume it, that they know that you shouldn't take like if something says take one square, you should take the one square and not eat the whole chocolate bar and not do it while you're driving and things like that. So I think that, like, there are ways that we can restructure society in a way that will really mitigate a lot of these harms. Because at the end of the day, most of the harms that come about because of drugs are not because of drugs. They're because of prohibition and because of the stigmas surrounding drugs and drug use. And if we're able to actually address those, and if we're able to address the societal conditions that cause people to be using drugs in a manner which hurts them, which hurts their communities, which hurts our society as a whole. If we're able to create the kind of environment in which people feel supported, in which they feel connected, in which they feel that they have things to live for, to improve, that they can make a change in the world, we don't need prohibition. We just need that. We need human ingenuity. We need human liberty. We need the ability to decide for ourselves how to live our lives.
And thanks for that. And then finally, um, this will probably take ages, but I still want to just make sure we get it out. So over the last few decades, we've had a sort of like consistent federal apparatus, right? Like, yes, things kind of shifted and moved around, but it seems like in the last handful of months, with Trump 2.0, like things don't seem consistent or predictable, and the like legislative branches don't seem to be operating in a way that like seems like checks and balances like we were used to. Can you speak to like what you've observed?
I think there's a lot of confusion right now, right? And I think that that's really permeating throughout. There's been a lot of changes, radical changes. I mentioned earlier, but governing by executive order, one of the reasons why, and you can have lots of other problems with the way that a constitutional government is set up, et cetera. But the way that our constitutional government is set up, we have three different branches of government, the executive, judiciary, and legislative branch. And each one of those has a unique role. And this isn't just under Trump, it's been over decades that we've seen an erosion of those things. Whether it's stuff like Chevron deference, which just I mentioned earlier got struck down, the fact that we had since the 70s that administrative departments could exist within the executive branch, and yet they could also write their own laws, thousands of them, tens of thousands of them, more than you could ever read in a day, and then enforce those laws, and then have their own police forces to lock people in cages because of breaking these laws that they didn't even know were laws and they had no way to influence, right? All of those are concerns. The fact that we're governing so much by executive order is a concern, and part of that is it makes it really confusing to know what to follow. Things are changing constantly. It's unclear. All of these things are a huge problem, and I think there's been a lot of confusion permeating in across our policy, whether it's things like I mentioned. We have executive orders just within the last month that are purportedly supposed to be attacking the opioid overdose problem, but are instead reversing the things that have actually caused opioid overdoses to come down, that are instead furthering the causes of opioid overdose crisis, and are setting up conditions that are likely to cause more people to both need to engage in illicit markets because they don't have access to jobs anymore because of an increasingly bad economy, or that are going to cause drug use to be a lot more dangerous, right? So you see all of that, but you also see a lot of confusion in things like Congress, right? We're all over the place. When I talk about things like cannabis, half the country, first off, thinks that cannabis is already legal. It's not. There's about 600 people every single day who get arrested for marijuana. Still, 600 people. 92% of those are for simple possession. Think about that. Think about how many people we're talking about if 600 people a day are arrested for cannabis. Still, that's not legal, right? And we've had this whole rescheduling fight. By the way, there's confusion even about things like that. If we reschedule cannabis to Schedule 3 over Schedule 1, which marijuana absolutely does not belong in Schedule 1 of the Controlled Substances Act, period. I mean, it's a legal farce. It's we do use it for medical purposes. It doesn't kill people, period. People do not overdose from marijuana. All of these different things that make something a Schedule 1 drug, it's just simply not one. So Schedule 3 is better,
Hmm.
but Schedule 3 is not legalization, right? It doesn't legalize any of the things that we really see happening. Your dispensary is not going to be legal under Schedule 3. And certainly you smoking your own weed is not going to be legal under Schedule 3 either, right? So like all of those kinds of things, there's confusion about what that even means, right? And then there's everything that's happening at the federal level. At the same time, we still haven't been able to push forward federal legalization to respond to the fact that 80% of Americans live within driving distance of a dispensary, and those dispensaries are in this weird quasi-legal state, and they have been for over a decade because we can't get Congress together to say, hey, we need to legalize interstate commerce. We need to stop using our powers to come in and raid dispensaries and businesses that are operating under the laws of their state. We need to allow people to bank, all of these things that cause all these other problems. And we don't see that movement happening, right? And we know, and I mentioned SSDP, we do a lot of like civilian education of folks in Congress and at these various levels. We've met with all these offices, and we can go in and tell them, and they know that their constituents want marijuana legalization. They also, for the most part, say that they want it, but they're telling us, hey, yeah, we get that, but we don't think that anyone cares enough. We don't think that anyone cares enough, and I don't want to stick my neck out on this issue and get the pushback from it, right? And so that's a huge part of this. That's why we're trying to get people together, get people to really put pressure and say, yeah, we do care about this. This is a big issue for us. And at the same time that this whole thing is going on, there are some exciting movements when it comes to things like cannabis at the federal level, and when it comes to psychedelics at the federal level. We're seeing stuff like we have when it comes to cannabis, there's stuff like States 2.0 or the Prepare Act, the EBDPA. Those are pieces that we think could move us closer to a better environment. But
Mhm.
when it comes to psychedelics, we're talking about stuff like access to MDMA therapy, access to psilocybin therapy, all these kinds of things. And yet these are all Schedule 1 drugs. That's an inherent issue, right? So there's so much confusion on that level. And then at the same time that Americans want marijuana to be legalized, we're now the Congress is trying to criminalize hemp. All of those like CBD, THC, Delta 9 THC, all of that kind of stuff. Congress passed a bill that will make these all illegal. All these things crimes again. They've only been legal for about 10 years. Make them crimes again as of next year. Rand Paul's got a bill called the Hemp Act, which would go the other direction and help make these things more legal. But there's not a clear direction. It's really confusing when it comes to drug policy. It seems as if everyone's just throwing something out there to throw it out there. There's a lot of confusion even within parties about who supports what. There's Republicans who want to see full psychedelic legalization and want to see access to therapies. There's other ones who want to see cannabis legalized. There's some who want one but not the other. The same thing with the Democrats. We see the same kind of weird splits. We see everyone's talking about how they're concerned about substance abuse disorder. There's a lot of people talking about the opiate overdose crisis, and yet they're lining up behind policies that actually will cause them to get worse. There's so much confusion, and there doesn't need to be, because it's really clear. The science is out there, the evidence is out there. We know what works, and we know that people having access to legal regulated markets where they're able to get what they want to get in a safe environment where there is no criminal element, that they are able to access medicines, because that's really what most of this is. Access medicines in a way that helps them, where they're able to access accurate information about that, will solve all of these problems that we're trying to solve. And yet we're just ignoring that. There's decades and decades of research in all sorts of different fields. They all point to the same thing, and yet we're not doing it. Why?
Yeah. $1 trillion in spending in the drug war, and it's hard to break propaganda.
Yeah.
Um, so, yeah, I think that's it for now. Thank you so much. How can people follow up on SSDP and follow you again?
Yeah, awesome. I will start with me. My name's Kat Murti. You can find me on Twitter, LinkedIn, whatever, at Kat Murti, and I'm on Instagram at Kitty Revolution. But more importantly, you can find SSDP at ssdp.org. Please go there, join up, fill out our form on there. Let us know that you want to be an ambassador, you want to join a chapter, that you want to get involved with some of the work that we're doing to get life-saving naloxone out into people's hands, to do that drug education piece, to change these policies, get people out of prison, rebuild our societies. Or just, hit that donate button. $5 actually really goes really far when enough people give it to us. And all of this work is funded that way. This is how we work to change the laws. This is how we work to get people the supplies that they need. This is how we fight the DEA. So please do go to ssdp.org, donate, join, because the war on drugs is a war on us, and we're trying to change that.
Thank you so much, Kat, and I hope we can do this again soon.
Yes, definitely. Thanks, Joe. I always love psychedelics today.
Thanks.